What if I told you there was a place where people weren't prisoners? They were experiments, and death wasn't the goal, but just part of the process. And this didn't happen in the distant past. It happened in the 20th century, hidden behind the label of science. In the 1930s, Japan was rapidly expanding its empire, and with that expansion came a growing demand for new methods of warfare. Among those ideas was something far more disturbing than conventional weapons. A secret division was created, known as Unit 731, officially presented as a research facility. But behind its walls, it became something entirely different. Located near Harbin in occupied China, the facility was isolated, heavily guarded, and hidden from the outside world. It was designed to keep secrets and to ensure they never left. The people brought there weren't called prisoners. They were referred to as logs, a term meant to strip away their humanity completely. Language itself became a tool to make the unimaginable feel routine. Most victims were Chinese civilians, but others included Russians and people from different regions. Many were taken without explanation, disappearing without a trace. The experiments conducted there were not about healing or saving lives, but about pushing the limits of the human body. And those limits were tested in the most brutal ways imaginable. Victims were deliberately infected with deadly diseases like plague and cholera. Doctors observed the progression without any intention of treatment. Some were exposed to extreme cold, their limbs frozen to study the effects of frostbite. What followed was not recovery, but further experimentation. The data collected was used to prepare soldiers for harsh environments, but it came at the cost of countless human lives. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia, allowing researchers to observe the body's reactions in real time. Pain was not avoided. It was part of the study. Everything was carefully documented, recorded like ordinary scientific work. But behind each note was a human life being destroyed. Unit 731 also tested biological weapons on entire populations. Diseases were spread through contaminated food and infected insects. These methods caused outbreaks that killed thousands, sometimes without warning. It was warfare that people couldn't see coming. Despite the cruelty, many involved believed they were serving their country. They saw their actions as a necessary sacrifice for national strength. This belief allowed them to ignore morality entirely. Over time, the unthinkable became normal inside the system. As World War II came to an end, orders were given to destroy all evidence. Buildings were demolished, documents burned, and traces erased. Remaining prisoners were killed to ensure silence. The goal was simple: leave nothing behind. After the war, many responsible individuals were never punished. Some even continued successful careers in medicine. In exchange for their research data, certain scientists were granted immunity. It became one of the most controversial decisions of the time. For decades, the story of Unit 731 remained largely hidden from the public. It existed in silence, known only to a few. Documents were locked away or disappeared entirely. Reconstructing the full truth became incredibly difficult. Survivor testimonies were among the only sources of truth, but for years, many were ignored or dismissed. Slowly, fragments of the story began to emerge. Piece by piece, the scale of the tragedy became clearer. In the 1980s, journalists and researchers started investigating more deeply. They began uncovering what had long been hidden. What they found revealed a much larger operation than previously believed. This wasn't isolated. It was systematic. Evidence showed multiple facilities were involved in similar activities. The scope was wider than anyone expected. With every discovery, the reality became more disturbing. This wasn't just history. It was a warning. Even today, full acknowledgement remains limited. Some truths are still debated or withheld. This leaves a strange reality where the story exists, but isn't fully accepted, and that keeps the discussion alive. The ethical questions raised by Unit 731 are still relevant today. They challenge the boundaries of science and responsibility. After the war, key figures from Unit 731 not only avoided prosecution, but were granted immunity in exchange for their research, which included detailed data on infecting humans with deadly diseases and documenting their physical decline until death. These findings were absorbed into military programs, meaning knowledge extracted through torture continued to be used by other nations long after the war ended. One of the most disturbing facts is that several of these doctors went on to hold high-ranking positions in universities and medical institutions. The same individuals who performed experiments on living humans later treated patients and educated future generations of doctors. Some experiments involved deliberately infecting people with diseases like syphilis or plague without their knowledge, after which researchers observed the progression until death without attempting any treatment. This allowed them to gather precise data, but at the cost of completely stripping human life of its value. There were also cases where live dissections were performed to study organ function in real time, avoiding the variables introduced after death. These procedures were carried out without anesthesia, meaning victims were often conscious throughout the entire process. Test subjects were sometimes used to evaluate weapons like grenades and flamethrowers, allowing researchers to observe the direct effects on the human body under battlefield conditions. In these moments, war itself became a controlled experiment, and human beings were reduced to variables. Women were not spared, and some were subjected to forced infection through acts of violence in order to study disease transmission. This added another layer of cruelty to a system that had already erased basic human boundaries. Other experiments focused on determining the limits of survival, including prolonged deprivation of food and water until total physical collapse. Researchers carefully recorded the exact point at which the human body could no longer sustain life. Extreme pressure experiments placed individuals in sealed chambers to observe how the body reacted under rapidly changing conditions. These tests often resulted in slow, agonizing deaths that were documented in detail. In many cases, researchers deliberately waited until the final moments to capture every physiological change before death, even when intervention was possible. This reveals that the goal was not healing or discovery alone, but absolute control over the process of suffering. Even after the war, many participants never publicly admitted responsibility for their actions. Some claimed they were simply following orders, distancing themselves from the consequences. However, the scale and organization of these experiments suggests something far more deliberate than obedience. This was a system driven by an ideology that normalized cruelty as a necessary tool. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable question about how ordinary people can become part of systems that completely erase moral boundaries, and how quickly that transformation can take place under the right conditions. Unit 731 demonstrates that the most dangerous actions do not always emerge from chaos, but from structure, discipline, and control. It was a highly organized system with clear objectives and calculated methods. This history challenges our understanding of human limits, especially when morality is replaced by the pursuit of results. And that is what makes it especially unsettling. Because perhaps the most disturbing aspect is not the experiments themselves, but the fact that they were rationalized and justified. That justification is what made them possible in the first place. Unit 731 left behind not only victims, but also a legacy of knowledge that continues to raise ethical questions even today. And those questions remain unresolved. The real issue is whether humanity can use that knowledge without accepting the methods by which it was obtained. And there is still no clear answer to that dilemma. This is a story without a clean ending, because its consequences have not fully disappeared. And that is why it continues to matter. If there is one conclusion to draw, it is that knowledge without morality can become one of the most dangerous forces in existence. Unit 731 stands as proof that the limits of science are not defined by discovery, but by the people who choose how it is used.